Imagine a scene so harrowing it feels ripped from a fever dream. A small band of resistance fighters, hidden within the impenetrable emerald curtains of the Sierra Madre. From their concealed vantage point, they stare down the full, mechanized might of an empire that had already toppled global superpowers. But this was no ordinary battlefield. This was a war fought in silence, in shadows, where every move became a calculated act of psychological warfare. This is not just a story of survival. It is a deeply human story of exhaustion, fear, and unbreakable defiance etched into every face. It became a 3-year odyssey through chaos, storms, hunger, wounds, and time itself testing the limits of Filipino endurance. The price of liberty was relentless, paid in blood every single hour, as comrades carried each other through pain and sacrifice. And yet, they refused to break. Filipino men and women standing firm, in defiance, even when the world believed they were already defeated. This forgotten chapter of World War II lingers like a ghost in the jungle. What happened between 1942 and 1945 will change everything you thought you knew about the Pacific Theater. When the smoke cleared over the charred remains of Cavite, the devastation told a story the world thought had already ended. As American and Filipino forces began their agonizing retreat toward Bataan, exhaustion and uncertainty filled every step, and the world assumed the Philippines had fallen. The Japanese propaganda machine declared a new order, promising prosperity while tightening a grip of iron and fear over occupied towns. But deep in the rural heartlands, from the rice paddies of central Luzon to the rugged peaks of Mindanao, something far more dangerous than a standard army was quietly forming. These weren't just soldiers. They were Filipino farmers, teachers, students, and mothers who traded their plows and books for bolos and scavenged rifles. For 3 long years, it became a brutal stalemate. The Japanese controlled the cities by day, but when darkness fell, the Filipinos took back the night. Beneath the surface, they built a shadow government, passing secrets and intelligence right under the noses of the occupiers, turning every street corner into a potential trap. Because even under occupation, a nation is never truly conquered when its people remain unyielding, watchful, and ready to resist. The sheer logistical audacity of the Filipino resistance stretched across thousands of islands, forming a network so vast and complex it still defies full understanding today. Imagine maintaining a cohesive fighting force with no centralized radio, no steady supply lines, and a relentless enemy hunting not just you, but your family. So the Filipino guerrillas turned the land itself into a weapon, transforming jungles, mountains, and terrain into tools of war through a fusion of ancient techniques and modern sabotage. They didn't just hide from the enemy, they became part of everyday life, blending seamlessly into the world around them. A simple Filipino vegetable vendor in a Manila market could be a high-level courier, passing secrets in plain sight without raising suspicion. And a quiet Filipino village priest, seen as harmless and devout, could secretly be orchestrating a dangerous ammunition raid behind closed doors. It became a war of 1,000 paper cuts, draining the Japanese 14th Area Army as they lost resources, strength, and morale to an enemy they could neither see nor understand. The psychological toll was devastating. Every smile from a Filipino local felt like a hidden threat, and every sound in the jungle carried the fear that death was already closing in. One of the most overlooked aspects of this 3-year defiance was the bamboo telegraph, a covert Filipino information network so efficient it rivaled even the Allies' advanced systems. Through hand-carried notes and subtle visual signals, like coded laundry hanging on village lines, the Filipino resistance passed messages right under the enemy's nose. Hidden deep in the shadows, Filipino guerrillas operated makeshift radios built from scavenged scrap, risking everything to transmit vital information. They meticulously tracked every Japanese troop movement, ship departure, and airfield expansion, turning raw observation into powerful intelligence. And this intelligence didn't stay confined to the islands. It was transmitted across the ocean to Australia, shifting the balance of the war. So when the American fleet finally returned, they didn't find a helpless nation. They arrived to a battlefield already prepared for victory. A battle-hardened Filipino internal army had already mapped out every weakness, quietly dismantling the occupation from within. Yet despite their role, these Filipino intelligence operatives remain largely unseen, forgotten figures in a victory they helped secure. Survival in the jungle became a war of its own, as Filipino fighters battled not just the enemy, but the unforgiving wilderness around them. For 3 long years, they endured malaria, tropical ulcers, and starvation, surviving on little more than root crops and sheer courage. With no access to proper medicine, Filipino guerrillas performed surgeries in hidden caves and crafted remedies from forest plants to keep themselves alive and fighting. The refuse-to-lose mentality was not just about combat, it was about preserving dignity and humanity in the face of relentless suffering. When the Japanese unleashed the brutal Sukching operations, entire Filipino villages were burned to the ground in a ruthless attempt to crush the resistance. But from those ashes, more Filipinos rose, grief turning into fury, fueling an even stronger wave of resistance. This movement grew into something greater than war, uniting Filipinos from all walks of life, rich and poor, into a single force. Together, they fought with one purpose: to reclaim their ancestral homeland from an enemy that had overstayed its welcome with violence and steel. The tactical brilliance of leaders like Ramon Magsaysay and the fearsome Hukbalahap commanders created a multi-front nightmare for the Japanese high command. They deployed hit-and-run tactics far ahead of their time, mastering ambushes along winding mountain roads where enemy tanks became useless. In a flash, they would strike a convoy and disappear into the forest, leaving no trace behind. Moments later, those same Filipino fighters would blend back into their villages, appearing as ordinary civilians before suspicion could even rise. This forced the Japanese to divert tens of thousands of troops into internal security, spreading their forces thin across the island. By doing so, the Filipino resistance weakened the enemy's presence on the main Pacific front, quietly shifting the balance of the war. Their relentless pressure may have shortened the war by months, perhaps even years, saving countless lives across the entire theater. Yet despite their impact, these Filipino fighters were often reduced to footnotes, their role overshadowed by a narrative that denied them ownership of their own liberation. Perhaps the most poignant and least discussed element of this story is the role of the Filipino warriors, strong, fearless, and essential to the resistance. These Filipino women were not just nurses or cooks. They were spies, recruiters, and even frontline commanders who earned the respect of hardened fighters. Using the enemy's assumptions against them, Filipino operatives slipped through checkpoints, hiding messages in their hair or within their clothing. Their courage became the silent backbone of the resistance, offering strength and stability that kept the movement alive. They managed the invisible front, ensuring families were fed and supported while the fighters remained in the hills. At the same time, they preserved Filipino culture, secretly teaching, guiding, and protecting identity as occupiers tried to erase it. This became more than a war. It was a unified resistance of an entire Filipino society, standing together against oppression. Because when a whole culture refuses to submit, no army on earth can control every home, every mind, and every heart. As 1944 dawned, the tension across the islands reached a breaking point, hanging heavy in the air like an approaching storm. The Japanese, sensing the tide of war turning against them, grew more desperate and brutal, unleashing some of the era's worst atrocities on Filipino civilians. But instead of breaking, the Filipino resistance sharpened its resolve, preparing for even bolder and more dangerous operations. They launched daring raids on internment camps like Los Baños and Cabanatuan, where Filipino guerrillas and allied forces fought side by side to free starving prisoners. These missions demanded flawless timing and deep knowledge of the land, an advantage only Filipino locals truly possessed. When the prisoners were finally liberated, the moment carried overwhelming emotion, relief, disbelief, and the first breath of freedom. The success of these operations sent shockwaves through Japanese command, forcing them to realize they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. By this point, the Filipino resistance had evolved into a powerful, organized force, operating like a sovereign military long before the world officially recognized their strength. The climax of this 3-year struggle wasn't a single battle, but a powerful surge of Filipino resistance that erupted as Allied forces approached Leyte. Long before the landings, Filipino guerrillas had already secured the hills, cut communication lines, and eliminated enemy strongholds across Key. They moved ahead of the invasion as the vanguard, Filipino scouts navigating the terrain and leading the way with unmatched precision. Their intelligence became the difference between chaos and survival, guiding Allied troops and preventing what could have been a devastating massacre. Together, Filipino resistance fighters and Allied forces formed a seamless partnership, executing a masterclass in unconventional warfare. But when the dust began to settle, Filipino fighters stood in quiet reflection, victorious, yet uncertain of what came next. A new struggle emerged, as these same fighters faced the challenge of proving their role and worth to returning authorities. Because in those 3 years of war, something deeper had been forged, a stronger, fiercer Filipino identity that the world could no longer ignore. Looking back at the cost of this defiance, the numbers are staggering. Filipino lives lost in overwhelming silence and sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands perished, not only in open battle, but in the quiet, brutal shadows where the resistance truly lived. Yet through it all, the refuse-to-lose spirit kept the Filipino resistance alive, unyielding from the first day of occupation to the final surrender. It was driven by something deeper than politics, a profound Filipino love for the land that no force could erase. What emerged was a massive, indigenous uprising, Filipinos from all walks of life rising together in defense of their home. In truth, the war had already been won in the mountains and barrios, long before the world would officially recognize it. Long before any formal surrender was signed, Filipino fighters had already broken the occupation from within. It was ultimately a victory of spirit over steel, a Filipino people who were told they were conquered, yet chose to live as if they were already free. Why do we not talk about this more? Why is this Filipino story so often buried beneath the more polished histories of the European front? Perhaps because it challenges the narrative. This is the story of Filipinos who saved themselves through sheer grit, courage, and ingenuity. From that struggle emerged something powerful. The Filipino Bayanihan spirit, unity pushed to its most heroic extreme in the face of war. They didn't fight for recognition, but for survival, for the right to exist freely, leaving behind a legacy that still lives in every Filipino who walks the land they defended. To understand the magnitude of this struggle, you have to see the daily acts of heroism, young Filipino fighters, barely out of their teens, leading battalions through unforgiving terrain. Armed with nothing but ingenuity, they used Paltic, homemade guns crafted from scrap, to outmaneuver and defeat heavily armed enemy patrols. Despite brutal tactics meant to break them, fear, violence, and manipulation, the Filipino people stood firm, unmoved in their belief that their cause was just. What looked like a solid occupation was, in truth, fragile, a glass wall filled with cracks, held together only until the collective defiance of millions shattered it completely. The transition from guerrilla warfare to full liberation in 1945 was chaotic yet triumphant, as Filipino fighters and civilians reclaimed their cities street by street. During the battle for Manila, Filipino resistance guided Allied forces through the urban maze, helping them avoid deadly traps and strike key enemy positions. Though the city was left in ruins, the spirit of the Filipino people remained unbroken, hardened by 3 years of relentless. From the ashes, a new nation began to rise, Filipinos rebuilding their homeland, forged by war into a stronger, fiercely independent people. Even today, in the remote provinces of the Philippines, elderly Filipino men and women carry vivid memories of the resistance, signals, songs, and the names of those they lost in the jungle. When they speak of those 3 years, their eyes reflect both pain and pride, as if the past still lives within them. They are the living archives of a forgotten war, and it is our responsibility to listen, to remember, and to tell their story with the respect it deserves. Because their legacy is more than history, it is a timeless reminder that the human spirit, once awakened, can never be extinguished. As we close this chapter of defiance, we're left with a powerful question. How many stories of bravery like this are quietly fading into time, waiting to be remembered? The Filipino resistance proved that the true strength of a nation lives in its people, those who refuse to bow, no matter the odds. They didn't just survive, they endured, they fought, and they built a legacy of independence that continues to inspire generations. So if this story moved you, let it live on, because history is only untold until someone chooses to speak it and carry its memory forward.